Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Pippa Rogerson, and I'm the Master of Gonville Caius College. Welcome. I gather we have nearly 200 of you signed up, so that's a really impressive audience. This panel discussion is on tackling inequalities from the pandemic. It's hosted both from Gonville Caius College, whose Caius Court you can see behind me, and the Centre for Geopolitics, both institutions in the University of Cambridge. In this joint seminar, we are going to be looking at the COVID-19 pandemics from some different perspectives. Without doubt, this pandemic has had a disruptive effect, and its impacts have been global, all around the world. So what might the solutions be to some of the issues that this disruption has revealed? Perhaps it's too early to tell. How might international law and organizations like the WHO and law about IP respond to the challenges that have been faced during the pandemic? What about science and technology? How will the needs of lower and middle income countries be addressed during and after this pandemic? The developed world has relied very heavily on highly complicated and expensive technology. And finally, we shall take a look at the international order. The pandemic appears to have exacerbated inequalities both domestically and internationally, and what that might mean for a new international order. So that's a pretty exciting menu. Before we start, can I just make some general points? This is an online video panel, and the structure is one that we've used very successfully at the events of the Centre for Geopolitics over the last 6 months. I will moderate a discussion between the panelists for the first 30 minutes or so, and then in the second half of this webinar, I'll be relaying questions from the audience. Now, you as the audience will be able to see and hear both me and the panelists, I hope. Your microphone and video will have been switched off automatically, so you will not be seen or be heard by anybody else in this webinar. But please do still communicate with me and the panelists. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A option. And if you click on it, when it opens, you'll have a chance to type questions, and that's how you can give the questions to the panel. Just a little note about how questions work best. Please start by writing your name and affiliation, because that gives us some context. If your question is to a specific panelist, then please put their name in the question. And finally, please could you limit yourself to just one question for the moment. We'll try and cover as many of your questions as possible, but given the numbers and time constraints, we may not be able to address absolutely everybody's. This webinar is being recorded for the website, so we'll post that recording on the Centre for Geopolitics website over the next few days. Firstly, to introduce my speakers, we've got 4 speakers on the panel today. They are all fellows of Gonville Caius College, which gives me great pleasure. Firstly, we have Professor David Abulafia. He's Emeritus Professor of Mediterranean History, and his latest book is The Boundless Sea. It's the winner of the Wolfson History Prize for 2020, and this is a shameless plug. It's a wonderful book. Please go and buy it. Dr. Rumiana Yotova is a lecturer and director of studies in law at Caius. She is also a fellow at the Lowcost Centre for International Law. She is a member of the Centre for European Legal Studies and the Cambridge Centre for Law, Medicine and Life Sciences, which gives her a wide-ranging perspective over the issues of today's panel. We also have Professor Axel Zeitler, who is a professor of microstructure engineering in the Department of Chemical Engineering and Biotechnology. He is the Kenneth Denby College lecturer. And Kanchen Lin is University Lecturer in Politics and Deputy Director for the Centre of Geopolitics. So he is really the mover and shaker for this panel this afternoon. And he's also the Tan Sophian College Lecturer at Gonville Caius College. So I think now I shall turn to our panelists who will each say a few words and then we'll start to have some discussion. So please, David, if you would like to start us off.
Yes, well, thank you very much. And what I'd like to do, because I'm a historian, and I'm not a historian of recent centuries, really, so I'd like to go some way back in time and present you with some comparative dimensions to the problems we're looking at. And I have to say, the more I look at them, the more I think that the examples, the main example I'm going to be talking about, the Black Death, is really very different in character. But I think it does help us to understand some of the economic effects that might follow on from a pandemic. Let me begin, first of all, take you back to Boccaccio's famous work, The Decameron, written in the late 14th century. And this was one of the great literary figures of Florence who experienced the Black Death. And he tells us about 4 different responses, which are really sort of mirrored in our own reaction nowadays. The first of which was sober and abstemious living in small isolated groups, sort of bubbles under lockdown. People enjoying themselves as a group, but trying to avoid contact with the outside world. The second was to eat, drink and be merry and just pretend that nothing is going on. Shrug the whole thing off as one enormous joke, I quote, which of course did increase mortality, but that sort of process of denial is something I think we also see nowadays. And there was also a middle course, which was to go about the city, but to sort of mask yourself. Well, it wasn't really a mask, but hold a posy of medicinal flowers under your nose. And finally, and this is what the people in the Decameron do, you callously run away into the countryside, into a villa, away from the heavy mortality. None of these things protecting people, absolutely. Now, there are obviously parallels with what we experience nowadays, but let's think a bit about the economic effects of a plague which, between 1347 and 51, wiped out half the population of Europe and the Mediterranean. And there were earlier examples of this. If we went further back in time, we'd find in the 6th century, under the Emperor Justinian, from 541 for about 3 years, a similar plague, which we now know was the same bug, Yersinia pestis, the plague bug, which in its most extreme form, pneumonic plague, had 100% mortality. But in relation to the question of inequalities, what interested me was the awareness among economic historians, though we need to distinguish between short and long-term effects, that the Black Death actually reduced inequalities. The Black Death and also the previous plague, the Justinian plague, came at a time of increasing economic difficulties. In the early 14th century, Europe was heavily overpopulated, and the reduction in population actually put an end to a cycle of famines, malnutrition. So actually the population, those who survived, there was more land to cultivate. They could vary the cultivation, so it didn't simply depend on the production of staple foodstuffs, basically grain. And they actually became a rather healthier population as a result of this improved diet. And generally also stimulus to industry. The countryside, lots of villages were evacuated, but people moving into the towns, getting positions as artisans. So we see something of an expansion of industry. Just think in England, the famous English cloth industry of the late Middle Ages really started to flourish from this point onwards. Previously, England had been an exporter of wool, but not so much of cloth. The whole balance between the urban and the rural population changed. And so, although within, let's say, 2 decades, 3 decades of the onslaught of the plague, there was massive disruption, what we see in the longer term is a complete restructuring of the economy, which, I mean, I remember in an examination, somebody once said the question, the Black Death was a blessing in disguise, rather an awful way of describing this horrendous mortality. But one can sort of see the point of the question. But one of the dimensions that's interesting and bears on our current dilemmas was that it didn't just go away in 1351. It came back, it became less virulent, became more localized, and it was still around as late as the 18th century. The great example, of course, people know about in England is the Great Plague under King Charles II in the 17th century. So what is one to make of that in relation to our current situation? Well, obviously, as a historian, I look backwards, I don't look forwards. And so I'm interested, however, in questions, because I'm a sort of maritime historian, I'm interested in the sort of effect that this will have on long distance trade, given that according to some estimates, 90% of world trade is conducted by sea. And in our own time, we've seen this massive increase in the movement of industrial goods out of, well, China, out of the Far East in particular. And that has been disrupted by pandemic. We've seen massive effects on the tourist industry and aviation, which is going to have very significant effects in Southern Europe, in countries whose prosperity, countries like Italy, whose prosperity has to some extent been built on the tourist industry. So we can expect some impoverishment there. And of course, we also have to think in terms of the massive changes to our way of life, an increasing preference for working at home rather than in offices, for delivering lectures in universities online. We may be forced into these things to some extent, but they may also become things that we prefer. But then they also do have implications for the labour market, which need to be borne in mind. The changes in the way that we acquire goods, very important again in relation to the labour market. So we find that Tesco has been hiring staff because they've really taken off as an online supplier in a way that they weren't before, but some of the supermarket chains which don't offer that are obviously in much greater difficulty. And all of this, that's in the short term, but then I try to think in the long term. And actually, my mind shifted also to what may turn out to be a connected question, which is the impact of AI. Again, in the maritime sphere, one of the issues that's arising nowadays is the development of crewless ships, absolutely massive container ships. We're talking about 20,000 containers on a single ship. I mean, really phenomenally large, which won't actually need a crew. There'll be somebody sitting in Felixstowe twiddling some knobs to make sure that this ship gets through the Panama Canal. Well, probably won't be able to do that, but anyway. So one wants to keep asking, well, to what extent will the changes in patterns of demand, which could follow on from the pandemic, have an influence on all of these plans that we have for the future? I mean, to give another example, just to conclude, I think of HS2. Do we actually really need that railway up to Birmingham and Leeds and Manchester if the whole nature of our working experience is going to change so much as a result of the pandemic? So I leave you with questions, which as a historian, I'm not going to try to answer.
Thank you, David, very much. I hope that the microphone issues are working out all right for everybody. It is sometimes a bit technically difficult to get that just spot on. So shall I turn now to ask Rumiana Yotova for her perspective on today?
Thank you, Master. So my perspective on the challenge of inequality in the age of COVID is through the lens of international law. And by international law, I mean the body of rules that apply between states. So I want to address three questions in particular. First, what are the relevant rules of international law that apply to COVID? Second, how do they actually address the challenge of inequality? And thirdly, can we draw any lessons going forward with the global health crisis? Now, when I refer to inequality, what I have in mind is the inequality between developed and developing states when it comes to access to health data and technology. So what are the rules of international law that are relevant here? I think there are at least three relevant legal frameworks. The first one is the law of the World Health Organization, and this is the reference that we hear most of in the news. Now, the World Health Organization is an intergovernmental organization, and it has 194 member states, so most states in the world are members. The second framework is that of international human rights law. And thirdly, we have international intellectual property law, which is found in the TRIPS agreement, binding on all members of the World Trade Organization. And I'm not going to focus on intellectual property law because it is not really my field, but I'm going to just briefly say that under the TRIPS agreement, member states have to protect patents in their own territory, but there is also a general exception based on the grounds of public health, which means that states can exclude inventions from patentability on public health grounds. And in practice, this means that developing countries could, in theory, issue compulsory licenses or revoke patents to level out the inequality when it comes to a future vaccine or COVID treatment. Now, turning to the law of the World Health Organization, the key instrument here are the international health regulations, which help coordinate efforts in public health emergencies of international concern, such as the COVID crisis. Now, the substantive rights and obligations under the regulations really focus on coordination between states when it comes to information gathering and sharing. So they address the early phases of a pandemic. They don't really say very much about what happens once there is a vaccine or a treatment. They do address inequalities briefly. For example, among their guiding principle is the universal application of these regulations for the protection of all people in the world from the international spread of disease. Now, this sounds really promising, but when we look at the one single provision that addresses inequalities, which is Article 44, we see a very qualified obligation on states to collaborate with each other to the extent possible to provide or facilitate technical cooperation and logistical support, and also to mobilize financial resources. But the obligation here really is only to collaborate rather than to actually provide financial resources or technical support to developing states. So it is striking that the international health regulations don't really say anything about virus sharing or benefit sharing, access to prevention and therapy, or indeed transfer of technology and capacity building for developing states. This stands in contrast with what has actually happened in practice in response to COVID. What we see is a prevalence of bottom-up approaches coming from scientific institutes, researchers. I will give you two examples. For example, it was indeed scientists and medical institutions that took the initiative to freely share the full genome sequences of the virus. And another example was initiated by the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, who decided to allow the pre-publication sharing of critical public health data, including with the World Health Organization, without prejudice to it being published in their peer-reviewed journals. Now, the World Health Organization has also been active in addressing inequalities, but in a very soft and non-legally binding manner. For example, it promised to come up with a COVID-19 open data sharing protocol, which is hopefully on its way to us soon. And it also established a COVID-19 Solidarity Response Fund, but to raise funds, it co-hosted a concert, and it has also called for voluntary donations. So it looks like when it comes to addressing inequalities in practice, the measures in response are either private or purely voluntary, and legally binding action from states is lacking. So looking forward, what could we do? Well, Well, the World Health Organization does have one instrument on benefit sharing and addressing inequalities. And this is the so-called PIP framework. That's the Pandemic Influenza Preparedness Framework. Now, this is very important because it addresses the sharing of influenza viruses and also access to vaccines and other benefits, which would be very relevant to COVID. But it only applies to influenza, and it was actually adopted in response to another health crisis, that was the avian flu, when Indonesia refused to share samples of the virus until it was promised access to the benefits that would be derived from that access, in particular vaccines and drugs. So with this PIP framework, member states are encouraged to share biological materials and also to ensure that benefits are shared equitably based on need and public health risks. However, the PIP framework is not legally binding itself. What is needed is a binding contract between the users of the biological material and the World Health Organization, and then annual contributions to a fund, which is then used to help developing states. However, this is an interesting model that could be followed with respect to COVID. However, in a way, the genie is already out of the bottle because corporations already have open access to the genetic data of the virus, and therefore they have less incentive to contribute to an annual fund to get more access to it. And finally, very briefly, human rights are also relevant when it comes to inequality and public health, and particularly economic, social, and cultural rights, such as the right to health and the right to benefit from science. These are all second generation of human rights, which means that they really focus on equality of access. And the state has to progressively realize them based on its own economic resources. However, there are drawbacks, and I think human rights in themselves are not enough to address inequalities, not least because they're purely territorial. They only bind states within their own territory, but not with respect to other states. So while there is a weak encouragement of international cooperation, there is no obligation to undertake it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rumi. Absolutely fascinating. So now, should we turn to Axel Zeitler, who's had a very exciting time through COVID, particularly at the beginning. I'm looking forward to hearing it, Axel.
Right, yeah, so from an engineering perspective, my interest really revolves around the inequality regarding access to technology, as well as dependency on equipment and expertise from the developed world to meet the needs in low and middle income countries. Now, in this rapidly spreading pandemic, it's been clear that, of course, the inequality is not new or indeed limited to healthcare. In fact, it might be equally or even more important for long-term challenges such as the climate crisis, where new technologies in manufacturing, energy supply and recycling are bound to be of critical importance. Now, in times of crisis, new technologies need to be developed rapidly and they need to be appropriate for the context. Such technologies need to be able to be rapidly matured from prototyping to full-scale production. And from a long-term sustainability point of view, it's important to grow such technology and manufacturing capacity alongside with education to provide ongoing opportunity for talent and for capacity to locally maintain the technology. And that is, of course, critically important to ensure that the new technologies are widely used and benefit many, but also their economic benefits support local communities. And then by providing meaningful work and income, not just in a few centers around the world, you can avoid potentially adverse knock-on effects, such as economic migration, for example. Now, for decades, parts of our manufacturing economies have been driven by a strong focus on rationalizing designs, increasing efficiencies to grow profit margins and reduce waste with an overall aim to increase productivity. And this has achieved an enormous amount of wealth creation and overall improved quality of life for millions of people around the globe. but it has also concentrated the technology development and availability to fewer almost gatekeepers. And this results in somewhat of a close cartel of players who govern the markets. Now, this is particularly obvious in the medical device industries as well as in the pharmaceutical industry. So products in these markets are subject to a huge amount of detailed regulation in order to ascertain safety and efficacy of the product. And in order to successfully develop products in these markets, significant amounts of investment are therefore required in terms of money and in time. Now, the regulatory process is, of course, absolutely essential to maintain the safety and the efficacy of a new product or drug. But it is nonetheless noticeable that the industry has shifted from one extreme to another. So from a relatively unregulated market, maybe only about 70 years ago, to the most regulated market there is globally today. And this has resulted in huge inequalities. And as a result, the drug and medical device markets are dominated by a select few companies who are responsible for the global supply. Now, the pandemic now has very clearly highlighted the extent of this challenge. We found it extremely difficult in so-called global north, I suppose, to respond rapidly to the pandemic that is caused by a novel type of virus, where completely new solutions needed to be developed and manufactured rapidly and at global scale. Now, in recent weeks, we had news of progress with regards to development of a vaccine against the virus that does cause COVID-19. And that's, of course, been a welcome source of hope. But we mustn't forget that the challenges with manufacturing and distribution of such a vaccine would be tremendous and quite unprecedented. Now, different vaccine technologies are being tested, but some of the promising candidates are based on methods that are so novel that we have very little experience in scaling up production. Medicines and vaccines are critical for all of us, and we tend to think of them as some ultimate high quality product. And so it will come as a shock to many that whilst most medicines are of very high quality, their production methods are not at all. In fact, the quality of medicine is still largely maintained by testing the final product and then discarding the batches of substandard quality. This is extremely wasteful at the best of times, but a huge challenge given the prospect to produce high quality doses of vaccines to supply the world demand in times of a pandemic. On top of that, disturbing evidence is emerging that systemic fraud in quality testing is endemic to Indian and Chinese drug manufacturing, where poor quality product is not discarded, but sold and distributed worldwide, in particular to countries across sub-Saharan Africa. On the medical device side, it is clear that designing, testing, and building complicated equipment such as ventilators takes time. The existing designs are typically so complex that they naturally keep the competition out of the market, even when their blueprints are made openly available during a pandemic. We're all familiar with the news reports that there were lots of failed attempts to rapidly develop ventilators as the pandemic gathered pace, with very few solutions maturing beyond prototype stage, and many large and highly reputable engineering companies not succeeding. So understanding and addressing regulatory requirements, which are quite specific and different on a country-by-country basis, has proven particularly difficult in that context. Now, here in Cambridge, we came together in late March this year to develop a design and find manufacturing solutions for a ventilator that was specifically designed from the outset for low and middle income countries to tackle this inequality in access to this vital equipment, in particular for sub-Saharan Africa. At the beginning of the pandemic, the WHO estimated that there were fewer than 2,000 working ventilators available across 41 countries in Africa. And the response that we made as the Open Ventilator Systems Initiatives was really to design a ventilator and an oxygen concentrator radically from a blank canvas and to remove any unnecessary components from that design. Now, this design we conceive from the start to be context specific and appropriate for needs in these low and middle income countries. So the team came together out of necessity of the situation and a shared vision to disrupt the market. Nobody on our team, in fact, had much experience in designing or manufacturing medical devices, and we literally started from scratch. Within days of this, we were able to make really good progress by working with a huge range of colleagues across academia, industry, medicine, in the UK, as well as partners across Africa. And through the unique network that we have here in Cambridge of academic, small and large companies in the Cambridge cluster, and the charities we have, we were able to connect with manufacturing partners in South Africa. The ventilator is now at a stage where mass manufacturing could start quite soon, but regulation still needs to be completed first. And the unique aspect of this work is that the design for the ventilator will be released freely under an open source license for good and with no strings attached to it. Now, this approach has been very successful, and we hope we can disrupt the market and bring technology that can ultimately be manufactured locally to help address healthcare problems in the region that go beyond the pandemic, such as childhood pneumonia, tuberculosis, and others, at timescales now and in the future. But overall, I think this serves as a great example of how academics working together with external partners can make a real difference. And it's very exciting to see how the university as a whole has embraced our initiative enthusiastically all along, despite us really starting bottom up and without formal plan in place. I guess that's all I sort of had to add.
Thank you, Axel. That was really enormously interesting. So time is marching on. I think we should turn to Dr. Kun-Chin Lin to tell us a bit more about the global geopolitical aspects of this problem and his views on it. KC.
Thank you. But there are basically two kinds of inequalities that have concerned modern political economists, from Adam Smith to Joseph Stiglitz. One is the inequality between nations, and the second is the socioeconomic disparities within nations. So I'd like to suggest to you today that the prior trends of inequality on both fronts have been intensified by the pandemic, but there's actually an opportunity on both for new state relations and the resetting of the domestic international market linkages so that policymakers could address the deeper problems of globalization and the rise of China, which have been the main engines of inequalities in our generation. So let me first set the scene by pointing out trends in international inequalities and domestic disparities before the pandemic. Before the pandemic, we've seen both PRC and US, and to a similar extent, middle powers, including UK and EU, dramatically worsening domestic inequalities since the 1990s. China's rapid growth engine has been driven by resource and labor-intensive export orientation, which exploits workers and offers little security to the emerging middle class. Whereas at the same time, the officialdom and the economic elites have been one and the same and extracting handsomely from the gains of marketization. And meanwhile, as we all know, US has fallen into a cycle of borrowing to sustain consumption and industrial hollowing out in several sectors. So in recent years, the Gini coefficient for these two superpowers have been very similar at 47 to 49, which is a major concern, and especially a concern that 2/3 of Chinese capital is now in private hands, which is very problematic for a socialist country. So these domestic inequalities are direct results of a very specific nature of globalization that's been sustained by a declining but still powerful Western-centric liberal order, and a generally cooperative bilateral relationship between US and PRC since the late 1990s. So as long as China will profess to support the Western order, it had nearly full access to Western markets and political systems, as we're learning. And these inequalities produce elites and stakeholders that continue to defend the status quo, even today, in the midst of the pandemic. Professor Niall Ferguson has coined this term, chimerica, for this sort of dysfunctional codependent relationship. So over time, this US PRC power transition, China becoming the world's second largest economy and military power, has created some self-interest on both sort of parties for addressing issues for lower income countries. So these issues include economic development, climate change, and a greater voice in international forums. However, it's entirely unclear whether these options have translated into improved income equality in the global South. I would say that the mixed legacy of our own Western commitment to the global South, ended with the Millennium Debt Relief Initiative, the HIPIC, several decades ago. Not much more has been done since. And middle powers such as the UK have found themselves more exposed to Chinese economic actions while struggling to address the problems of the welfare state that was obvious by 1990s. So with the pandemic, I think we're going to see some intensification of prior trends, Specifically, both superpowers, as we are seeing now, are retrenching with economic protectionism and techno-nationalism. Given the staggering mounting losses, it's become politically easier for our leaders to seek greater sacrifices from our own population. The Chinese domestic consumption is tanking, due to a host of factors. Of course, the biblical proportion of the pandemic, the Lowcost plague, that's the latest thing, flooding, various other things. And not to disregard the U.S. trade sanctions and the general global downturn. So things are so bad that in the past few months, in May, the Chinese policymakers actually decided they were not going to release GDP figures for this year. And meanwhile, even as they sort of point out that still 600 million of China's population live on a monthly income less than $146 US. So we're going to see these two countries dig in deep. The Chinese leader Xi Jinping has already proposed an economic strategy called dual circulation that will rely heavily on domestic industrial and consumption basis, essentially bracing for war-like situation against the United States. And this means punishing Western firms that won't offer up technology and market access, Western sports associations, companies, and media that are critical, and it will make political demands on less developed countries that become indebted to Chinese funding via the Belt and Road Initiative. So there's no more win-win game in town. So looking at these situations, we have to really worry about what will happen to powers such as the UK and the European powers. So with our democracies under severe internal critique, with identity politics being driven by social mobilization, we're offering headlines that mask broader structural causes for inequalities and playing into the hands of hawkish foreign policymakers. China will certainly use these divisions to prevent the formation of an alliance of democracies seeking to hold accountable for human rights abuses and other problems. So, what's the good news? It's hard to see that the horizon now, but I would posit two pathways. First, I think pandemic shows us that a clean decoupling is just not feasible. So middle powers like the UK and Taiwan will become critical portals for restructured global supply chains, global value chains, and new nodes of power and material exchange. So the political systems and the social contractual priorities of these countries will affect how flexible they will adapt to pressures from these superpowers. Our strong firms will become more evident as suppliers and buyers shop around for new partners. So if we're able to generate consensus at home and forward-thinking policies, we could actually increase our strategic autonomy in the face of highly politicized global politics and possibly even gain leverage over the superpowers. Second, I think that decoupling could turn our attention to our own workforce and economic relations, incentivizing governments to invest in digitalization and green production and upgrade the regulatory framework to improve innovation and equitable distribution, as Axel was just pointing out with medical devices. So these domestic actions will overcome the bias for short-term, transactional, financially driven, borderless politics of the past. And we're looking at possibly a leveling effect globally as US and PRC decline due to their divisiveness at home, opening the way to a more polycentric regional dynamics of recovery. In that sense, countries that can hold it together could gain relatively in global standing. So I'm suggesting to you that the pandemic disruption might lead to a better equilibrium in the long run. And this is what Professor Abulavia was talking about, the blessing in disguise. So what we need is a rejuvenation of democracies and an inclusive and entrepreneurial market economy. That will be the key. That was what Rumi was emphasizing about law and international organizations. We could see a new golden age of institution building. Thank you.
Well, Casey, thank you very much for that. It started very gloomy, but it ended rather more cheerfully. But I think there's rather a lot of work to do before we get to those the blessing after the pain. Now we've got some questions coming in, so that's really good. The first one from Roger Bass is that South Africa's G20 ambassador wrote, "We believe that when history is written, it will describe this moment as one that has contributed significantly to the reform and creation of an inclusive global and financial architecture working in the interests of the peoples of this world." I think, Casey, that's your end point. But he specifically says, what might global Britain find opportunity in collaborating with the global South to bring about such a shift? How powerful are we going to be in trying to activate ourselves? I don't myself get the impression our government's got any energy or competence to do anything, but that might just be me. Casey, maybe that's one for you.
Sure. Mr. Bass, thank you for your question. I think there is an opportunity, and some of that will come from other efforts we've already invested in various areas. And I'll focus on Southeast Asia because that's an area I know something about. So our FCO has been working with the Vietnamese government, and where a government like Vietnam, and this is generalizable, caught between two superpowers. China has been a major influence. Vietnam has tried to diversify by appealing to Japanese investment in infrastructure, and this is an area that Britain has excellent firms in, and excellent capabilities to plan ahead, risk manage, insure various other things. So they have been very welcoming of British influence in the area to try to come in and maybe even participate in very thorny legal issues such as the Mekong River Commission and all these issues with water rights. Similarly, I think global Britain has been extended in the past few years to South China Sea and the rule of law with UNCLOS, the ruling of Philippines versus China in 2017. Britain has been sending its warships to the region and participating in joint exercises and making a point about the international maritime law. And this is an area where we're increasingly being asked by Australia, Singapore, and other countries to have participation in all sorts of military upgrading and coordinations. And this is something I think will contribute and will be intensified with the pandemic.
Thank you, Casey. We've also got some questions talking about a slightly historical aspect. So I think these are for you, David, maybe. Is there evidence of state responses to pandemics in the medieval and later time? And do you think that this college's way in which we can help people who have been so badly disrupted? I mean, what do we do in the past, and what lesson can we learn from that? You might need to unmute yourself, David. No, I think we might need to come back to you. Maybe we could, because we can't hear you. We'll ask another question. Sorry about that. There've been a couple of questions for Rumi. One from Jonathan Hack. Is there scope within international law to deny patents to a vaccine developer on the basis of public policy?
Thank you. That's a very good question. So I would reverse the premise. It is really not international law's place to do that. What international law does when it introduces these general exception clauses on the basis usually of public health, public morals, and public order or policy is that it merely recognizes the power that states already have under international law to regulate and introduce these restrictions. So international law merely recognizes the power that sovereign states already have to do that vis-a-vis their own subjects, be they corporations or individuals.
So perhaps not as powerful as we might like, but nonetheless interesting. Got a couple of questions here from, I think they're slightly political questions, but they may also be slightly historical ones, which is, we're facing a virus that has a much smaller fatality rate than, say, the Black Death. We're not talking about half a population dying in 3 or 4 years. Are we being led into a panic by the government and an international community that itself is panicking? And indeed, a more pointed question, which is how far, in respect of the bad consequences of inequality, are they a result of government's responses as opposed to the actual virus itself? Casey, I think that's probably one for you.
My apologies. I'll address part of the question. I understand the sort of political context is really important, but I would just qualify that in two ways. One is that we don't really understand, and I'm not a medic here, so my impression is that we don't know the long-term effects. We don't know how likely this virus will become chronic. So this is something I'm not, I wouldn't just take it lightly at this point. And second is, I think the virus does point to a bigger sort of set of questions about the relationship between environment and the sort of emergence of virus, as well as the governance system and the emergence of the virus. One got to be asking ourselves, why have we seen so many viruses in recent years, many of them coming from China? What are some of the institutional factors as well as the environmental factors? And perhaps that will help us, will alert us and open our eyes to the bigger linkages. So I wouldn't be so easy to dismiss all this as alarmist.
Well, thank you for that. One for Axel's just come in. Your focus on ventilators seems to have been overtaken by events, and oxygen concentrators seem to be more urgently needed. But as far as I remember, I think you're doing both, aren't you? But I'll leave you to answer that one.
Yes, so I've spoken mostly about the ventilator, but we've also got a program running on developing an oxygen concentrator. And that's been running for quite a while, because when we started talking with our colleagues, in particular the medics in sub-Saharan Africa, all of them pointed out as well that, well, they don't have ventilators at all, but they also don't have typically oxygen from the wall or even bottled oxygen. So oxygen concentrators are a really important part of the solution. And our ventilator, well, we're calling it the Ventilator Systems Initiative because we need the ventilator, oxygen, and we also need power supply. So things need to go together, and the ventilator is specifically designed to actually take oxygen at all different pressures. So that could be from a bottled oxygen, wall outlet, from a concentrator, or it will indeed run on its own. I mean, what we've seen is that there are lots of technological solutions that have been put forward, but very few of them actually work in all contexts very easily. In the developed world, there is a lot of oxygen available. And so these CPAP devices, where you just essentially supply the patient with a lot of pressure of oxygen, is sufficient. But if you don't have any oxygen available, you can't do this. The second aspect to this that needs to be addressed is essentially uninterrupted power supply. And that's another challenge that we face in a lot of places across sub-Saharan Africa and other low and middle income countries. But I suppose you come from one problem to the next, and ultimately it goes down to a lot of need for better infrastructure, and it's not a problem we can solve in the short term, but we can supply solutions that can work in the circumstances we're in, and then work from there.
Well, that all sounds quite exciting. Of course, things are happening so quickly, they're happening faster than we can develop solutions to them. We have a couple of questions from Eleanor Rylance. The first, which I think is quite interesting, and I'm not sure who wants to answer this, which is there have been very different approaches to the pandemic from different countries. So in our view, what level of personal freedom must a population be willing to sacrifice in the pursuit of public health? It's, I suppose, another question like, is it really worth what we've all been doing? We don't really have a medic on the panel, so maybe we could just all give our personal views as to whether we think we've got the balance right. I'm finding I'm having to face this as the students are coming back in October, and how far are we going to prevent them from visiting their boyfriends and girlfriends in other households, which they're not supposed to do, and what are we going to do about this? So this is something that's really very live for us. And currently our processes are to try and collaborate with the colleges so that we have a community response rather than do things one by one. And we'll see how that goes. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to say? Please pitch in. No, not so well, I'm afraid, David.
Oh dear.
Yeah. Casey or Axel or Rumi, do you have anything you'd like to say about the balance? Have we got it about right?
Well, I'm sorry that things are not working with David. Yes, I mean, I guess one of, I'll refer to a recent article from the Center for Geopolitics by Suzanne Rain, where she discusses sort of whether we should be considering a trade-off in our political system. So whether there's a sort of democracy versus authoritarian systems in our responses to pandemic. And this is something obviously everyone's discussing. You know, Anna Applebaum is writing a book about this. But the crucial thing I would say is that there's such a diversity, as Eleanor pointed out, of experience, that if you were to look at countries like Taiwan and South Korea, it's not necessarily true that countries that have done the most have asked their citizens to sacrifice their freedoms. It's also kind of odd to point to authoritarian governments and to say, well, this is why they're doing so well. There could be many reasons why they have not done so well to date because of precisely the same causes. And governments, of course, are constantly taking advantage of situations to intensify controls and monitoring and data collection. But this is not something that's particular to democracies, So I think there's still quite a lot to be worked out as to what works in this against pandemic and whether we are in fact sacrificing liberty.
Can I make one very quick point from an engineering point of view? I guess this is risk management, right? So I guess we need to see, we have a very highly contagious virus. I think that's what makes it so problematic. We need to manage that risk of infection and passing it on. Ultimately, whether we balance the risk properly, only a historian will be able to tell us in future. And I think that's the difficulty with the situation we're in. We have to balance the risk in ways we don't exactly know and is emerging. So things will go wrong, but I think the important thing is to react and react decisively when it's clear that the data shows that we need to act.
I would say from an international law perspective that there is always a tension, especially when we think about human rights, between protecting the rights of the individual on the one side and then protecting the public interest. So striking the balance is usually left to the individual states to decide based on their historical and cultural background, religious and moral considerations, which partly I think explains why different states have struck the balance differently, but also why different populations perceive that encroachment on what they perceive to be their rights differently. And another thing I would say is that we use the word rights very colloquially, but there are legally protected human rights. And actually the free movement of persons is only something that's part of EU law, and it relates to free movement between states. So even though sometimes people might be subject to restrictions, that doesn't necessarily mean that these are restrictions on their legally recognized rights.
Thank you, everybody. Now, we've got quite an interesting question from Professor Tony Stoller, who said once a Kean, and the answer to that is you're always a Kean. You never escape the clutches of your education here. So he asks a question about the importance of digital usage and access, that it really appears from the way in which we've all been affected, both for work and socializing, that actually digital access is becoming almost something you could think of as a public utility. Do any of the panelists have a comment about how we need some sort of governmental intervention to ensure that airway to the outside world really is going to be available for everybody, particularly the dispossessed and elderly members of society? Are we happy to leave open source, what is the British Telecom's digital access for us in the hands of a private company, which was once a publicly owned company?
I guess from an engineering point of view, the question is a simple one. It's just a question of resource, right? It's technically perfectly possible to do it. It's just a question like building a high-speed railway that may not benefit everyone in the country, but it is a resource that everybody can use. Things can grow from there. Nobody can say how they will develop. There's a question where you put resource. And I think this is a very important resource going forward, so we should think very carefully about it and not dismiss it as a unnecessary expense. It may be a very wise investment.
Well, an economist in me, and I gave up economics a very long time ago, would say it's crossing over into becoming a public good, in which case it's something which you do expect that taxation should start to be applied so that it is publicly available for everybody if the market is failing to make it available. I don't know, Rumi, if you want to say anything about that.
This makes me think about the right to benefit from science and its applications and how different states give effect to it. And indeed, many states report that what they do is ensuring there is internet access for everyone. But this is done more through internet cafes and public libraries. So I'm not aware of any state at this stage treating internet as a public good, but I think that would be an excellent way forward.
Thank you. Some more questions coming in, mostly for KC, I think. Do you think it's possible, KC, to explain the striking contrast in the efficacy of governmental responses to the COVID challenge by different countries? I think it's possibly too early to tell whether the outcomes are indeed going to be strikingly different or but do you think it's something to do with the way in which you were talking about authoritarianism?
Yeah. I will probably broaden, and of course my case selection of countries I know very well is quite limited, but I'll broaden the analysis to think about prior experience and culture. In Asia, many Asian countries, the past experience with SARS is obviously critical in terms of how the population responded right away. The way technology figures into people's lives makes it much easier for them as well to monitor. So these factors, so beyond what the government's policies are, could be critically important.
Thank you. One for Axel. Your low-cost ventilator seems very interesting. How much will it cost? And can it be manufactured easily in developing countries?
Well, that's something I hadn't really emphasized. That's a tremendous advantage. The design we've come up with costs only about $1,000 and a typical ICU ventilator is more in the order of $15,000. And as part of the process that we've gone through from prototyping to productionizing it, we've spent an awful lot of time making sure that we are accommodating supply chains in sub-Saharan Africa for this design. Having said all this, this is not a hobbyist device, so we will need fairly sophisticated manufacturing processes to really make parts of this. And so that's why we've been teaming up with a household appliance company in South Africa that has the required infrastructure, because in order for this to be safe, it needs to go through regulation, and the production process is an integral part of the regulatory process. So it's been very important for us to find partners who share the same vision. But in principle, this can be produced moderately easily. And it's certainly something where we're thinking about maybe trying to find manufacturing partners in a few countries first, and then distributing from there, and other countries then taking on that capability longer term. People can choose. The technology is completely open. Then they know what they're getting themselves into. But it's a big process, so we're hoping to make it all work. Yeah.
You've done it amazingly in 6 months, I think. A sort of follow-up, what are the advantages and disadvantages of having this blueprint which can be internationally distributed, maybe even 3D printed?
So 3D printing is possible, but it's not really useful for a product in mass production. It's too slow, and it also doesn't give us the quality we need from a long-term ventilator. So it's a rapid prototyping technology that we've used extensively. But sharing the designs openly allows people to grow confidence that what we are making is an affordable ventilator, which is just as good in quality to what is available in the West. We were very clear that we didn't want to come up with something that is just inadequate or poor in its performance. So sharing things openly makes it absolutely transparent. People can check for themselves, but also they can build business models around this design that make it viable for them commercially. So being open doesn't mean there can't be a business, but that's somebody else's business. And that's the beauty of it. So we can focus on the design and try and help get it out in the world, and then others can pick it up and make it happen. And that's really important.
Okay, thank you. We might try just once again to see if we can hear from David Abulafia as a final word. You'll need to unmute yourself, David.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, amazing. All right, because, all right, I was actually writing a response. Now, in relation to the first question, I was actually quite interested that that came up, because people did, in relation to bubonic plague, they began to realize that infection was passed by breath, by human contact. They began to realize it was passed on clothes. So there were all these questions which we've had to face about, you know, how is this actually communicated, and what are the dangers of certain types of communication? You know, we're still arguing about whether paper and cardboard and cloth and so on, about library books and that sort of thing. So these are classic questions. In Milan in the 14th and 17th century, they closed the city. Now, how they managed to do that without experiencing massive famine, I have no idea. But there were attempts to put up those barriers. The other thing I wanted to say was in relation to the point about sort of has there been an overreaction. I do think we have to go back to some of those images. I'm not so much thinking of the images from this country as those from Bergamo and other Italian cities, which were truly horrifying, and the sort of sense that it wasn't going to be possible to cope with this disease. Of course, so much less was known about it, and so much is still not known about it. But the sort of the assumption that there were going to be certain ways of dealing with it, it turns out, as people will confirm, that ventilators are important, but actually the emphasis on them, it's attention away from other ways of dealing with the patients, as I understand it. So there are all sorts of issues of that order, which lead me, and I'm not defending the government, I'm not attacking the government, I'm simply saying there was so much guesswork at the beginning, before that argument. It was, you know, even those chief scientific officers were making intelligent guesses. And I think pointing the finger, blaming people for the decisions they made, some of which were disastrous, vis-a-vis care homes, vis-a-vis cancer patients, vis-a-vis, and this comes back to the question of inequality, those who found themselves locked down in, you know, tiny flats in high-rise buildings in some of the poorer parts of our cities. You know, these decisions, you know, there were negative sides to these decisions, no doubt about it. Anyway, that's very briefly what I was planning to say.
Well, I'm terribly sorry. I think we're running out of time, but I think maybe that is a good point to end, which is that it's going to take a long time in history to work out whether we got the answers right or not, and we can't rerun history, so a lot of it will be in response to guesswork. But I think we are just going to have to hang on tight and do the best we can for the ride. So thank you, firstly, to all our panelists for their thoughts and their responses to the questions. Thank you all for attending, and particularly for asking such great questions, and I'm sorry we couldn't answer all of them. I'd also like to thank Arjun for doing his best on the technical side. There are shortcomings to digital, partly broadband and partly anything. But from Keys and from the Centre for Geopolitics, thank you all very much. Have a very good evening.